We're going to move on to scopes now. We're going to do an interactive exercise. We're going to do that game that we really like to play. Everyone was like, I really like it, Bianca, when we play that game where everyone goes in a line and says what happens next, especially when it's tricky and I say the wrong thing. It's going to be one of those moments. So we're going to go through this. It's a testing suite, and all these tests are testing various combinations of scope. And so scope is just the area where a variable has access to some value. So when we're defining variables, we know that there are such things as global variables and local variables and the like, right? A global variable is available throughout the entire code base. And usually we declare that by just not putting a var in front of something, right? Usually not a good idea. Or we can attach it directly to the window object. So that's a global variable. And then we have local variables that are inside of functions or inside of blocks. And there are some tricky rules around when certain variables have access to certain values and not. And so we're going to go through some scenarios. We're going to run this code and see what happens. And then there's the testing suite here. We want to get the test to pass. So I'm going to describe what these tests are doing so that we get a little bit familiar with this code base. But really what you should be worried about is the function body of the callback of the it statement. So when it says it, blah, 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 it's the body of the function. But let's start at the top. So this is just a regular testing suite. I think it's Mocha, maybe. And we're wrapping it in this function. It goes all the way down here, and then we're immediately invoking it. That's what those parentheses are doing. So it's wrapping an anonymous function and then invoking it immediately. And then we have this describe block, which, what do you think if I did type of describe? What do you think that would be? Cameron.
Undefined.
Undefined? That's a good guess.
Object.
Object? Who thinks it's going to be an object? Who thinks that it's going to be something else? What do you think it's going to be, Eddie?
A function?
Why?
Because it has the parentheses of like scope exercises, etc. right next to it.
Yeah. It looks like it's a function being called, right? Yeah, and that's what it is. So describe is a function. It takes two arguments. One is a string that describes this block, and then a callback function that has a few different tests. And so if we look at our UI over here, we see that it creates this scope exercises title, and then it has all of our tests inside here. Okay? So we have an actual variable that we're just initializing here. Then we have a before each function. This before each function just is called before each it block. So when you see this ending, this will be called automatically. Have you guys done test-driven development or written tests like this? Cool. Awesome. Okay. So then we have an it block. And what do you think this is if we said type of it?
Well, it's a function.
Yeah, also a function. So the first thing it takes is a string that's a description of what it is testing. And the second thing is a callback function that it's expecting it to return whether it's passing or not. So this saying says expect actual to equal the string inner to be true. what do you think this evaluates to? What does that return?
A Boolean?
That's a good guess. It has to return some sort of object, right? Because we have these dots.
To be true, so yeah, Boolean. I'd double down
Some
on
sort
that.
of object that has something like this. You see that?
Like an array of objects?
Well, that's the only way you could get these dots to work in JavaScript, right? To be true. We should put something like that. Anyway, I'm just showing you that there's some interesting applications to all of the rules that I was saying before, but they don't change. They look a little crazy, but people are just building on the rules that we went over and doing creative things with them. And
In the
they're just
chat room,
doing,
they're asking where does 2 dot and B dot come from? And that's
well, maybe this is Mocha.
Mocha.
Yeah. I think the describe before each and it is Mocha, and then the expect might be try. I don't know. I'd have to look. I haven't looked at the.
But the library is basically all you have to say there.
Yeah, it's from the library. We're using a library here, and I'll share this after, and you guys can have it and play with it. Okay. So I just gave you a little tour of what's going on. Any questions so far before we get started? Okay, I want one question before we move on. Just make up one. I like a silly one, a funny one.
Is there a reason actual is all caps?
Just to make it stand out, really. Yeah, because if you see, we're going to be reassigning actual a bunch of times, just to see what the value will hold.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. And so, knowing that in JavaScript we have function scope. Do we know that? Have you guys heard about function scope? Is that something you've heard of? So before recently, we only really had function scope, and that means that variables that were inside of a function only had access to the values defined there or in the parent function. So for example, here's a function, here's an inner function, okay? If we had a variable name, for example, we couldn't access it over here. Because it's outside of this function's scope.
So in the function or child functions?
What do you mean?
You said parent function before.
Mm-hmm.
So you can access variables declared in a function or in functions declared in that function, but not the other way around?
No, only in the parent.
Only in the parent.
So you can only look up.
You can only look up.
So if you think of scope as sort of like a hierarchy, you have a global scope being available to everyone, and that's your window object, things on the window object if you're working in a browser. And then you have, your first function and then your nested function, and you can think of it as like your global scope, outer scope, inner scope, more inner, inner, all the way down. It's many deep. Yeah. And so inside of the function, you can only reach for values in the outer scopes. All the way up the chain though. And then through that sort of chaining from inner to outer, we have masking of values. So if I declare a value in here, and I also declare a value out here, then this name is going to be inner, even though the name out here will be Mark. And so once I get out of this function, if I reference name, this is going to be Mark.
My name's in a video. I'm
Yeah,
gonna be
you're famous now.
Thank you, Bianca.
You're welcome.
There's a question in chat about the very first line, the
Line 1?
immediately invoked function expression.
What about it?
Just didn't know why it was there. Or like,
Oh,
didn't know what an if he is. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Is
So,
that something you're getting into?
not really.
Okay.
All you need to know is what this does is it lets you call the function immediately. So once this page is loaded, it will just call this function immediately. That's all. And we'll set up all of our tests.
Maybe show the bottom part of that.
Yeah, I showed it earlier, but I can show again. So here we are calling it. Uh-oh. There's a clue down there. I should get away from there. Okay, great. So we're going to walk through how the function is running inside of these it blocks.